Hi, my name is Dr. Erin Kearns. I'm a professor at the University of Alabama, and I will be talking today about policing terrorism, which is part of what I do research on. So, thinking about who's involved in policing terrorism, how is policing terrorism similar to or different from regular everyday police work? So the first thing I just want to go over is thinking about this term of Homeland Security. Now, for most of you, this is a term you've heard pretty much your entire lives. Really, though, it's not a term that really came into existence until after September 11th. So, because we didn't really think about or talk about Homeland Security pre-September 11th, it's not entirely clear exactly what specifically we mean by Homeland Security, what's included and what is not. There's not one clear definition of this. When we think about who all is involved and what are some of the roles in Homeland Security, we think about this as preventing terrorism, responding to terrorist attacks, and providing technical support to local agencies. And that's coming from the federal government. Agencies like the Department of Homeland Security providing support to local police officers, but really thinking about what sort of comes into preventing terrorism. This is certainly something that there's many actors that are involved, local police being one of them. In terms of responding to attacks, local police are the front lines, almost always the first responders when an attack does occur. And then there's the necessity of partnerships between local, state, and federal law enforcement, thinking about how do we prepare for the potential for an attack. So who all is involved in Homeland Security? So from the federal level, we have the Department of Homeland Security, which was created in 2003. We have the Department of Justice, which includes the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, ATF, etc. We have the Department of Defense, and they're taking the lead during times of war, but these three federal agencies all have to coordinate amongst each other as well. There's the intelligence community broadly, and the intelligence community has gone through a number of changes over the last 20 years or so. It's not entirely clear who all is involved even in the intelligence community, but this involves state, local, federal employees across the United States and really across the world, because so many of the threats that we face or that are faced around the world are international potentially. So there's that need for information sharing across jurisdictions, across countries as well. When we think about some of the biggest threats, though, within the United States, and we think about where attacks tend to come from within the United States, these do tend to be local. And this is where you have the incredible importance of state, local, and tribal law enforcement, who have to be able to share information amongst each other, and then also filter that information up from the local level to the state level to the federal level, in terms of coordination, preparation for when an attack happens, in terms of communication for potentially suspicious activity that should be investigated further, and then for deployment of resources as well. So after September 11th, there's what you might have heard of, the 9/11 Commission Report. This was looking at some of the weaknesses in Homeland Security as we now conceived of it, trying to understand how did 9/11 happen, how sort of were the pieces not put together beforehand. So the main findings of the 9/11 Commission Report is that the intelligence gathering basically had not been emphasized across the country. There was poor communication between agencies, and nobody was in charge of intelligence for the whole country. The recommendations from this report were to focus on defense intelligence and collaboration, that agencies needed to be incentivized to work together. We had to think about this balance between security and freedom. Some of the responses here is that government agencies largely supported these massive changes, but the public's reaction was a bit more mixed. So I just want to talk a little bit about how those changes took shape nationally, and then what the role is of local police to be critical partners in policing terrorism. So looking at some of the government partnerships. So Department of Homeland Security needs to be able to communicate with other entities. There basically needs to be this federal mission of coordination and emergency response planning, but this needs to also expand out the local roles, that giving local police departments all around the country, and there are over 18,000 of them, the information necessary to know what to look for and who to communicate to, how to communicate if suspicious things occur. Some of the issues, though, with partnership across agencies, and this can be across agencies at the federal level, there's rivalries between Homeland Security, Department of Justice, Department of Defense, etc., sort of turf wars. You think about this with any groups of people, there's going to be some conflict. So there needs to be some sort of way to incentivize groups to work together. There also can be issues with partnership and potential rivalries between the FBI and local law enforcement, and thinking about basically how do we minimize these rivalries and how do we incentivize people at all of these different agencies to work together. And the way that's really worked for this, that's really been, I think, a novel and important model in how we push forward is these Joint Terrorism Task Forces, or JTTFs. This is a sort of sensible model to having these separate systems. So pre 9/11, there's all of these separate systems at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, that aren't communicating critical information to each other. And when, where there are, frankly, these sort of structures in place that don't incentivize cooperation between different agencies. So the JTTF model is an alternative towards these separate systems. And JTTF model, basically, there's not one JTTF model. The way that this works is that the JTTF, or in the fusion centers in various different locations, are tailored to meet the needs of that specific area. So if you are in Omaha, Nebraska, you don't need to have the Coast Guard involved, most likely, because you're in the middle of the country, there is no coast. Whereas if you are in New York City, for example, yes, it would make sense to have someone from the Coast Guard as part of this JTTF, the local JTTF, the local fusion centers as well. There are, of course, some issues with local governments not wanting their people to participate or share information with the federal agencies, but the way that these typically work is that you have members from all of the different constituent agencies where it would make sense for them to be able to collaborate. A person or two from each of these different agencies all work together in this sort of shared resource place where they develop relationships with each other. So yes, it might be that your FBI and your Department of Justice, your Department of Homeland Security, your Department of Defense, and your Coast Guard, and there might naturally be these rivalries. These people are then all working together in the same location, developing these relationships so that when something bad happens, they already know who to call. They already have built relationships with these individuals. They're not building from scratch and doing it retroactively, but these are proactive relationship building amongst actors from different agencies. This is something, if you recall back to the Boston bombing from a handful of years ago, this was something that really, sort of the success of this was so clear in the aftermath of the Boston bombing, is that you had Boston police chief, the FBI, the head of the JTTF there. You had all of these individuals so clearly working together from the get-go to identify and locate the perpetrators. And this was really such a huge success in large part because they already knew each other. They'd already built these relationships, so they weren't dealing with this information sort of hoarding or trying to figure out what to do after an attack happened. Those infrastructure in that place was already in place. Thinking about what policing terrorism looks like then, from the local police officer perspective. So there's a study that was asking police chiefs do you think that things like community policing, proactively building relationships with community members to increase trust and legitimacy, to increase cooperation, is this compatible in counterterrorism? Most police chiefs that were surveyed said that yes, they do think that community policing would be compatible with counterterrorism efforts. And this is important because there's sort of been, in some ways, this assumption that policing counterterrorism needs to be different than policing other crimes. Harsher, requiring more sort of tactical gear. There really isn't evidence, though, that that's the case. Looking at what police chiefs say is that, that community policing is compatible with counterterrorism. In a study that I did in 2016, asked police officers in 3 departments what they thought. Did they think that community policing was appropriate in counterterrorism? Most agreed that this was the case. There were some differences between officers in terms of their experience with community policing and their support for community policing in general. But officers generally thought that community policing was equally appropriate in counterterrorism as it was to address other crimes. So there's potentially barriers to engaging in community policing, particularly department level support and officer level, and individual officers sort of buy-in to the practice. But when we think about, attacks, either attacks that have been thwarted or suspects who have been captured, a lot of this comes from regular old police work. Police officers doing their regular jobs and just happening to identify, Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber from about 25 years ago. He, after the bombing, was apprehended when he was pulled over for having an expired tag on his car. The sheriff saw a gun on his seat. He was brought in and ticketed. During that time, there was a news briefing saying I had identified him as the likely perpetrator. He was already in the sheriff's custody. I mean, it's regular old police work is what tends to identify either potential threats or apprehending suspects after an attack has happened. What's really important to think about here, and why it's so important to really focus on some of this relationship building, is looking at why do people cooperate. We need, for successful counterterrorism, we need to have information from the general public to alert law enforcement to suspicious activity, to things that they suspect that perhaps their friends or family are doing, inside the home, where you wouldn't even necessarily notice or ever know that that these were, planning activities. So we know people cooperate with police, report crimes or suspicious activity to police when they view police as more legitimate, when police have treated them with more procedural justice. The question, though, is, does this apply to all crimes? Does this apply equally to all people? In another study that I conducted back in 2016, I surveyed about 2,000 people across the country, asking them about their views of law enforcement overall, their views of local law enforcement, their experience with police, and their likelihood to report various crimes to police. And what this is showing, this graph, there's a lot kind of going on here, but really looking at here at the bottom, we see the terrorism versus homicide. People are most likely to report suspected terrorism or suspected homicide. So we see that that's not, the people's, what they say they're likely to report to police, the pattern is pretty similar for terrorism as it is for more common crimes. And this is similarly impacted by how legitimate people think the police are. People who think the police are more legitimate are more likely to say they would report crime. People who have greater trust in local law enforcement are more likely to say they would report crime. People who have more positive experiences with police are more likely to say that they would report crime. So again, we think about sort of how do we increase cooperation with police? How do police-citizen interactions relate to counterterrorism? Really, the evidence is suggesting that sort of police doing their regular job, engaging proactively and positively with communities, will help, will increase the likelihood that members of the public will report suspicious activity to law enforcement, that this positive interactions between local law enforcement, state law enforcement, and members of federal agencies will help to increase cooperation amongst members of law enforcement and everyone who is involved in Homeland security. So thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you found this informative.